Let's go to this chat now. Basic Education Minister Siviwe Gwarube says that the country still faces serious shortage of special needs schools. More children with disabilities in South Africa are left without access to appropriate schooling. Despite government's commitment to inclusive education, thousands remain on a waiting list. Parents and advocacy groups have raised concerns over the lack of resources, infrastructure and trained teachers. For more on this, we are now joined by Dr. Praveena Sukhraj-Ely, who is the Chief Director of Governance and Compliance for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities at the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities. A very good morning to you, Doc. Thank you so much for making time for us this morning. Where are the hurdles when it comes to ensuring that we have enough infrastructure as well as facilities where we can take children who have special needs to ensure that their constitutional right to education is also fulfilled?
Good morning. I think the biggest challenge that we have in the country is understanding what inclusive education means, because inclusive education means that all children with and without disabilities must be able to learn in their neighborhood schools. And what we clearly still have is a situation where learners with disabilities only have the option of going to segregated special schools far away from their homes. And unfortunately, many of these special schools have large waiting lists because they're unfortunately unable to cater for the number of children with disabilities that we have in the country. And quite honestly, even if we had to build 100 or 200 more special schools, that will not resolve the problem that we currently have with children with disabilities accessing education. We need to think further. We need to move towards developing the inclusive education system that we're supposed to develop since 2001, when we passed Education White Paper 6, where we said we were going to incrementally move towards doing away with segregated schools, but putting together one inclusive education system that comprised all the supports and resources, infrastructure that catered for all children, so that we could be socially, academically, in every respect included from the time the child is from an early stage, so that when we reach adulthood, we all able to live together, not looking at difference between persons with disabilities and those without.
Yeah, and the thing about what you're currently raising also, Dr. Sukhraj-Ely, is that these are people who live in society, but we expect of them, once they go and get their education, to be doing so in a segregated space. But after all of that schooling, when we now speak about employment, we expect them to come and work also with people that have gone to quote unquote so-called normal schools. But how do we come to a point where we say inclusive education also includes dealing with what society looks like, because the world of work doesn't have a separate space for people with disabilities?
Absolutely correct. I think this is the key problem. I think many people misunderstand and believe that mainstreaming is inclusive education, meaning placing learners with various disabilities in mainstream schools. That is far from what inclusive education means. Inclusive education means that all children, especially those with mild, moderate, severe support needs. I won't call it disabilities, because disability is very diverse in type, in degree, in individual circumstances, whether they live in rural areas, urban areas. The aim is to include children with disabilities in every aspect, but within their community, so they don't have to be sent far away from their homes, far away from their families, and then come back after they finish what the education that they receive up to matric, get into a tertiary institution where those children without disabilities have not integrated and interacted with children with disabilities. And it's very difficult then for that assimilation to occur on a social, to put everyone on an equal playing field, even academically, economically, in all respects, because the education that is then received, unfortunately, is not equitable. There's no equal access to opportunities, but we expected as persons with disabilities to function at the same level. I mean, I myself am a totally blind person. I went to a segregated school for 14 years of my life, away from my family, came back out, went to tertiary institution, which was the so-called normal University of KwaZulu-Natal, expected to assimilate. The adjustment more for the social inclusion was worse than the academic inclusion, because it was, one could assimilate and be included in that respect. But when it came to the rest of it, the equity that needed to be built in, the understanding, the attitudinal barriers, and that was created by society because we were not included from the word go, to say all mainstream schools need to become inclusive schools. They need to support in terms of resources, educators, district-based support teams, itinerant teachers, textbooks, supports, rather than building more and more special schools that is going to cost way more budgetary resources, human resources, etc. However, you're still not going to reach the numbers you have to, because children with disabilities are diverse and spread across the country. The aim must be to actually upscale our current resources within our neighborhoods to make sure that they support the children that live there.
Yeah, we know, Doc, at least when it comes to buildings and infrastructure, that there has been some progress that has been made. And even looking at when you do build currently, there is a requirement that you need to make sure that you, for instance, have ramps and you have the necessary infrastructure to support people with disabilities so that they have access to the building. So that is the brick and mortar. But when it comes to so-called cognitive disabilities or intellectual disabilities and the autism spectrum disorders, how do we envisage, or how should we envisage that work in the so-called mainstream schooling system, where you have children with those disabilities, cognitive disabilities, also in the so-called mainstream schools?
So this is where we need to think outside the box and make sure that where there are children who require the additional levels of support, that we are able to provide this even within our schooling system that we have. Even if we have particular classes within the schools that cater for, in terms of resourcing, in terms of educators, in terms of adapting the curriculum to that particular child's needs, so that they can thrive and reach their full potential to whatever extent that they possibly can. But that must be the aim. I don't think looking at the brick and mortar, making sure we have a school for just children with autism or children with intellectual disabilities is going to resolve the situation, because it's going to still result in exclusion. We need to include within our neighborhood schools and our community schools, but at the same time provide the supports, because it's pointless in mainstreaming children and including them just to be there physically, but not providing them with the relevant academic, social, emotional, whatever other therapies they might require to enable them. The aim is to create an enabling environment within those spheres. And then children with disabilities and those without disabilities, from the age of 5 years old, 6 years old, will be able to understand that we are all one society and we need to be able to interact and we include each other from that early age.
Yeah,
it's about bringing the support to the child,
Yeah.
rather than the child being taken away.
Yeah, we must teach empathy from a very, very young age. I just quickly want to tell you of the poll that we're running today and I'll ask you about the preliminary results that are currently in. So we're asking our viewers this morning, are there any special needs schools in your area? 53% of those who have responded said that yes, there are several, I think, which is a good indication somewhat, but it doesn't really speak to the point that you are raising about what inclusive education looks like. 10% saying that I'm not sure, and then 37% saying that there are none. What's your response to what we have received from our viewers that have participated in this poll so far?
Yes, I think that it is quite correct. It's actually showing the results. I would say even where there are special needs schools in the area, the question that one would have to ask is, are those special schools actually catering to the needs of that particular disabilities? Because you get schools for the visually impaired, schools for the deaf, schools for the physically disabled, all of which will not be able to take on learners. You would find that that is what happens. And even though there might be special schools in particular areas, they are also not, they have large waiting lists. So they would not actually be able to take on those learners. So quite correct, I would presume, your poll is turning out to be, but I think it goes deeper than just whether there are schools in the area that would actually provide, yes, the care, the needs and the access required.